Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the history of Bible translation and all this entails concerning the transmission of the text as well as the canonicity of the text. This story starts with the autographs themselves and then goes into the modern era, so it really piggybacks on what we've already talked about concerning the transmission of the text as well as the canonicity of the text. Then it picks up the story and carries it on through the Reformation and then on into the modern era, and it talks about how we get the modern Bibles that we have even today. So it's a lot of history to cover, but it's a very fascinating story, and it has many implications on how we understand the Bibles that we have in our modern translations. The art of translating Bibles really is an ancient practice, and it goes back to even long before even Jesus was born. In the ancient Near East, one of the major languages spoken was Aramaic. It was one of the major trade languages for the what we call the Fertile Crescent, which would include ancient Babylon and ancient Israel. Also in the Eastern Mediterranean, there was Koine Greek, and Koine Greek was a major trade language due to the expansion of Alexander the Great's empire and the Hellenistic culture that brought along with that. And the Romans piggybacked on top of the Hellenistic culture, so many of the traders and educated individuals of that time and space would have known Koine Greek, and there was some overlap, especially in ancient Israel, between Aramaic and Koine Greek due to the influence of the Hellenistic culture and the influence of the Babylonian culture in that part of the world. So Bible translation from Hebrew impacted both of these languages. In Aramaic, there were a number of what we call targums that were translated. These were translations or paraphrases of the Old Testament that were widely circulated among Aramaic-speaking people that were done by rabbis. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it was widely used out throughout the ancient world. In fact, most of the Greek-speaking Jews that would have been in the diaspora in the Eastern Mediterranean probably used the Septuagint. And we see some evidence of this inside of the Bible, where the book of Hebrews, for instance, quotes from the Septuagint, as well as maybe some other Greek translations of the Old Testament. It was an important translation for that reason, as well as many of the other Greek-speaking Jews in the area that wanted to understand and learn the Scriptures but couldn't read Hebrew themselves. The New Testament really didn't need to be translated until much later because it was written in Koine Greek, so there was really no driving reason to translate it into another language. But in 382, Jerome translated it, the New Testament and the Old Testament, from the original sources into Latin, and this became the Latin Vulgate translation, and this became the major translation in the church, in the Latin-speaking church from then on. And this is because the use of Greek was falling out of favor in favor of Latin, particularly in the western part of the Roman Empire. So they would use this translation as part of their liturgy, and it was widely used, and it's still widely used in many Roman Catholic churches today. The Old Testament foundation for modern translation is a story that starts way back whenever the autographs were originally written. And we've already talked about how they were transmitted and how the canon was formed, but it starts with the autographs, which were the original documents that were written by the prophets and by Moses and the psalmists and so on. And those were transmitted and collated until the canon was complete somewhere around the time of Ezra. Then sometime after that, the complete canon was widely circulated throughout the Eastern Mediterranean region, and we got the Dead Sea Scrolls. We had what became the Masoretic tradition, and then several other distributions of this, such as the Samaritan Pentateuch and some of the texts that went into Egypt that became the foundation for the Septuagint, which was, as we mentioned, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's from this Masoretic tradition that we get the Masoretic texts that were transmitted over the period of the 1st century up until about the 11th century, whenever we get one of the final copies that they produced by the Masoretes, and that would have been the Leningrad Codex, which is the earliest known complete copy of the Old Testament. There are actually earlier documents in this, but this is the earliest known one that was in its entirety, and it's the one that became the basis for the BHS. The BHS is the Biblia Hebraica Studiatensia, which is a German for the essentially Hebrew Bible, and the BHS is the underlying text from which most modern Bible translations are translated from. However, it's not the only thing they consider. There's consideration taken into account from things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of these other texts that do exist whenever modern translations are made. The great thing about Hebrew and the preservation of the text is there are very few variants in Hebrew, and the homogeny among all of these various manuscripts means that there isn't a whole lot of differences between, say, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the BHS, or the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Leningrad Codex. So the consideration of some of these more ancient texts really doesn't have a huge impact on the BHS, which in its modern form is basically what is in the Leningrad Codex, which is the foundation for most modern translations, even before the BHS was complete. So we have a fairly good confidence level that we have in our modern translation, a highly accurate representation of what was actually written in the earliest manuscripts that we have available, and ultimately the autographs, the original documents that were created by the original authors themselves. The story of the New Testament is somewhat more complex than the Old Testament because it's not as linear. There's a lot more complexities introduced because of how the New Testament was copied. It starts with the autographs, which were written by apostles or associated apostles, and then we get the complete canon somewhere around AD 90. And then we get from the complete canon the circulation of the books around the early churches, and we still have some manuscripts from this era. And these are some of the oldest manuscripts that we know to exist. And these manuscripts fall into a category called the Alexandrian texts, and these are usually considered by scholars to be closest to the original manuscripts that were given to the early churches and the original documents. There are some other textual families that are later than this, and one of the earlier ones would have been the Egyptian texts, which are similar to the Alexandrian texts, but they appear to have other influences. So these would be additions to the text, some similar to some of the other text families we'll mention in a moment, but they're distinct from the Alexandrian text for that reason, but they're still early texts. Then there's some eclectic texts, and the eclectic texts are just a group of texts that really don't have a geographic grouping like the Egyptian texts, the Alexandrian texts. These are some that were written in the middle periods between the 4th century and 600 AD, or around that time period, and there's really no geographic area to where they're tied to, but it's a small group of texts that represent just some spattering of manuscripts that fit that time frame. And then there are the Western texts, and now the Western texts were from the western part of the Roman Empire, and these texts are very few in number, but they are distinct from some of the other texts because they do have some distinct qualities about them that we don't find in some of the earlier texts like the Alexandrian Egyptian texts, but they do go back to the Western Roman Empire, and they have a lot of things about them that don't show up in the next one, which is the Byzantine text. Now, the Byzantine texts are some of the later texts, and this text family really represents the majority of the texts that are known to exist. These are later texts, but there are just literally thousands and thousands of these, while some of the other ones, they probably either number in the dozens or even just a spattering of texts, such as the Western texts. The Byzantine texts were largely what were available to most scholars in the Reformation period. And that's because these were the ones that had come out of the translation of the texts in Constantinople and around the 4th century, had been copied and preserved in the European context. And from that, we get the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus was a early attempt to build a New Testament, a standard New Testament text that would represent the textual foundations for Bible translation. and a man named Erasmus went about trying to collate texts and to form a Greek New Testament that could be used for Bible translation. Now, some of his earlier work was incomplete, and he had to come up with a Greek translation for some of the early texts. So he would take things like the Vulgate and then translate it back into Greek. So there would be a lot of differences between what was actually in the original Greek New Testament and what he translated back into Greek. However, in the later editions that were updated, some of this backwards translation was replaced by more original documents as these documents became available, and the later editions became more accurate and better than some of the earlier editions of the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus was really the major work in the Reformation period, and it inspired Martin Luther in his work and other writers to translate the Bible into other languages. Martin Luther was, as we know, the reformer who nailed the 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral, and there sparked the Protestant Reformation. One thing he believed is that the Bible should be available in the common language of the people, and for him that would have been German, as that was where he was from. German. The German Bible that he produced was a long work. It took him several years to complete it, but the Luther Bible was highly influential in the German language, and it's still read today in much the same way that the King James is read in English. But the English Bibles come after this period, and it was largely because of the work of a man named William Tyndale. William Tyndale was influenced by the work of Erasmus and Luther, and he wanted to produce a New Testament for the English-speaking world, and what he did was translate the Bible out of Greek and Hebrew, and in doing so, he ended up being labeled a heretic. He was imprisoned and then tried, and then he was killed and burned at the stake as a result of that, around 1534. However, his dying prayer was that the Bible would be translated into English, and that happened within 5 years after his martyrdom. And so in 1539, the Great Bible was produced, and that was one of the earliest translations of the Bible into English. And it used the same textual basis as the Luther's Bible, the Textus Receptus, which was available to them at that time. And some more subsequent Bibles that came out would have been the Geneva Bible. And the Geneva Bible was the Bible that the Pilgrims would have used at Plymouth Rock when they landed. So it was widely quoted in their documents and some of their liturgy. If you go back and read some American history, you can see the Geneva Bible being quoted, and there's some copies of it in museums and so on around the United States because of that. The King James Version, as it's called in the American sphere, King James Version was commissioned in 1611 by James I of England, and it sometimes goes by the Authorized Version, and it was commissioned by James I after the unification of Scotland and England to form the United Kingdom. And it took some time to translate, but it became the most widely used version of the English Bible in the English-speaking world for several hundred years, and it's been revised a few times since then to update the language. But the textual basis for that has pretty much remained the same, and that would be the Textus Receptus. Now, for modern Bible translation, the paradigms that were used by these early translators were still adopted in modern Bible translation. The difference, though, is that the textual basis for modern Bible translation takes into account much more than what the Textus Receptus did. The Textus Receptus was basically late Byzantine text that existed, but the modern Greek New Testaments that are available today have available many more manuscripts than the Textus Receptus. So they have not only the Byzantine text, but also these other textual families that we mentioned. So you have the Alexandrian texts, which are some of the older texts that are in the available in the Greek, and then you have these other three textual families: Egyptian, Eclectic, and Western texts, and the Byzantine text. And modern Bible scholars take these five families and use textual criticism. That's the process of looking at these texts, collating them, looking at the differences, and then trying to understand when variants were introduced and why they were introduced, to interpolate back to what the original manuscripts would have said based on the plurality of texts that are available. So they consider things like where things came from, like the Byzantine text or the Egyptian text or Alexandrian texts, and then also how old they are. And the general consideration is that older ones would be more closer to the original autographs than later texts. And so some of these considerations go into producing the modern Greek New Testament. And the modern Greek New Testament is the work of many New Testament scholars globally that come together to do this, and it's in two varieties. And one of those is the UBS Greek New Testament, and the other one is the Nestle-Aland Greek New Testament. Now, these two New Testaments are really the same in their content, but they differ in mostly their punctuation. So, but the work that goes into forming them is the same text, the same kind of work. It's just two different, really, publishers, if you will, with some minor differences in the punctuation that they produced. And it's from these modern Greek New Testaments that we get our modern Bible translations that we have today. And so anything that was pretty much produced in the last 100 years or so kind of follows in the vein of using these other textual families beyond the late Byzantine texts that are available to produce modern Bible translations. And so when we read the modern Bible translations, they will sometimes include footnotes concerning parts of the Bible that the earlier manuscripts didn't include, but the later ones did. So if you read like the long ending of Mark, for instance, as it's called, the earlier manuscripts, such as the Alexandrian text, didn't include that, but the later ones, like the Byzantine text, did. And so if you read your Bibles, they include that as part of the Bible, but they will put a footnote or something like that, indicating that the earlier manuscripts don't include certain portions of it. So there's just something to look for in your Bible when you're reading through it, especially in the New Testament. You'll see some difference. Some Bibles will include certain verses while other ones don't, and that's largely because the production of the modern Greek New Testament tends to exclude things that weren't included in the earlier manuscripts. Rather, they believe those were additions that were engrafted into the text at some later date. Another thing to think about whenever we talk about Bible translations are modern Bible translation philosophies. Now, in the early days of Bible translations, they didn't really have a lot of experience translating the Bible, so they basically did what we call formal equivalence or word-for-word translation. And so what they did is basically looked at the Greek and Hebrew words and tried to find the best match in the target language and then translate it into that word. The difficulty with formal equivalence with word-for-word translation is not everything always translates very well. For instance, you might have one word in a target language that might carry multiple meanings, while in the original language it doesn't, or vice versa. And so what you end up with is some words that might be awkward translations of given words from the original language into the target language. Sometimes word order doesn't work either, so you have to rearrange words so that the word order in the original language doesn't really work in the target language. And then there's some other things to consider, like tenses or things like that don't always get reflected in target language or in the original language. So you have to figure out how to accommodate that in the target language. So word for word translation does a great job of representing the original text to the best of its ability in the word order and so on. But sometimes the reading of it might be a little bit rough because of that. And that's why some modern Bible translations adopt the idea of dynamic equivalence. And dynamic equivalence is what they call thought for thought translation. So what it does is it tries to look at phrases and sentences in the original language and then consider what that phrase or sentence might be best translated in the target language. So this will produce a more readable translation that tries to accurately reflect the original language in the way the thought patterns flow through the text. Now, the weakness of this one obviously is that it runs a higher risk of misrepresenting the original text because there's some more level of interpretation that goes into the translation effort. But in many cases, the dynamic equivalence does work well whenever the target language and the original languages aren't exactly parity with one another's, and that's true of, say, some like Eastern languages where that aren't highly inflected like Greek is, for instance, and so formal equivalence is harder to represent in some of those Eastern languages. So a dynamic equivalence or thought for thought translation might work better in that circumstance. Now, that's a for instance. Now, not everybody does that. It just depends on the translation philosophy adopted by the translators. And then the third translation philosophy that's used is it's called the functional equivalence. Now, this is typically known as a paraphrase, and it'd be hard to call these translations because they're really more of interpretation because of the high level of interpretation that goes into the production of these works. And these are designed to be very readable and very approachable, and they use a lot of modern idioms and a lot of modern expressions in their translations in order to make the reader have the ability to understand it easier. And the obvious trade-off there is that it runs a higher risk of misrepresenting the text than the other two that we just mentioned, such as dynamic equivalence or formal equivalence. These are the three major Bible translation philosophies that are used in Bible translation today, but it's hard to say where really one stops and the other one starts. So it's really more of a gradient, and it might look something like this, where you have formal on the left and functional on the right and dynamic in the middle. And various Bibles will fall somewhere along this gradient. So on the left, you would have more formal Bibles like the KJV, New King James, NASB. And then on the right, you would have the paraphrases like the Message and the Living Bible. And then somewhere in the middle, you would have something like the NIV. And then somewhere between dynamic and functional, you would have things like the New Living Translation. And then somewhere between formal and dynamic, you would have things like the ESV and the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So you can see how these aren't exactly discrete categories, but rather they flow from one to the next, and then from the next to the far one on the right, the functional. So the idea here is not to try and identify which category one Bible falls into or the other. It's just to understand that translation philosophies are doing this tug of war between readability and formal equivalence, and trying to come up with the best mix of readability and formal equivalence in the translation philosophy. And it's really hard to say which is best in many respects, but it's basically understanding that it's a struggle that translators have to deal with, and they have to make compromises in some cases to be more formal by sacrificing readability, or being more dynamic and sacrificing formal equivalence. Regardless of which one of these poles you gravitate towards in your modern Bible reading, just understand that modern English Bibles are plentiful. So if you are doubting one, you can always pick up another one and read it too. English speakers are really spoiled to have so many translations available, and online you can go to a site like Bible Gateway and really read dozens of different English translations right on the internet for free. And the debates over which one of these are better or worse is really comes down in many ways to what's the preference of the reader, and what are the purposes and intents of the reader whenever they're doing their Bible studies. And it's really no excuse to not read the Bible, but you can pick up any one of these and read one. I typically will read multiple translations when doing Bible study, because I do like some of the more formal equivalents that is offered by the King James and NASB, but I also like to pick up something like the NLT or the NIV to understand how the thoughts might have flowed, or something like that. So the idea here is not to prefer one translation over the other in terms of what they might include, but rather to understand that there are multiple good translations in English and that one can pick these up. Bible translation is still going on today, and the work of Bible translation has become the work of missionaries over the last 2 centuries, and it's still not complete. According to Wycliffe Global Alliance in 2011, there were over 2,000 languages that still needed a Bible translated into their language, and there was no current intent to do so. And you can see that a lot of that is concentrated in Asia, Africa, and the Southeast Pacific Ocean. This is significant because of the amount of work that goes into translating Bibles. It is not something that is simple, and it's a massive undertaking for anybody to want to dedicate their life to it. So our English-speaking world can definitely be in prayer and in support of the effort to get the Bible into many languages as possible for all of these people that do not currently have it in their language. And for many of those who do receive it for the first time, they celebrate it in the way that someone might celebrate the birth of a child or something that is a very significant event, because it is such a glorious occasion. And there's some video on the internet that I've kind of put into clips here to show you just that. What you're seeing here is the Kemial people of Papua New Guinea receiving the New Testament for the first time in their very own language. They are having a celebration in order to commemorate this event, because it was a significant event in the life of their tribe, and here they are dancing and singing to celebrate this momentous occasion.